He had just said the words that made everyone clap, kiss, and lift their glasses, and 3 blocks later the confetti still clung to the cuff of his suit like a promise. Adrien Cole kept telling himself the night would settle into the tidy ledger of his life. Vows filed, taxes in order, another merger penciled for next quarter. He had practiced contentment for years the way other men practiced restraint, an exacting discipline of calendars and delegations that kept the rest of the world at arm's length and his heart clean of daily mess. The newness of being someone's husband fit oddly in his palms. Cassandra slipped her fingers through his on the back seat of the car as they rolled away from the hotel. Her nails were painted a soft shell pink, and she laughed at something the driver said as if the sound were private and delicious. She rested her head against his shoulder for a breath. The veil had fluttered away and her hair smelled like jasmine and success. He answered her with an automatic tightness, smile, soft words he'd chosen earlier that afternoon, and then something in the street caught him so sharply he forgot how to breathe. Across the intersection, under a sodium street lamp that made everything under it a little too honest, Lena Hart walked with 2 small packages cradled in her arms. 2 swaddled shapes moved like a modest tide beneath her coat. She wore a gray beanie and a coat that had seen better winters, and when she pulled one baby closer, she hummed a lullaby with an inclination of her head as if the city noise were not there. He knew that tune. It had been her absence all these years. His mouth dried until his wedding band felt heavier than it had any right to be. For a suspended second, the world narrowed to the crosswalk and the sound of the car's engine. Cassandra's laughter, the confetti, the flash of cameras, everything receded, and the thing he had convinced himself he'd left in the past stepped into focus with a baby on each hip. Something inside him fell away. Calculation, control, the patina of a life built to keep surprises at the other side of a glass. He told himself he could be rational. She could be anyone else's. The timeline could be a lie. But the city offered no convenient answers. Lena's hair was longer and threaded with stubborn silver at the temples. She moved with a weary grace he felt in his chest like a missed note. The babies' small heads rocked against her, their faces anonymous and immediate at once. One of them glanced up, eyes the size and steadiness of someone who had no use for his past or his titles, and for an instant Adrien pictured a tiny hand closing around his own. He blinked as if that would reset the image. Cassandra noticed the change because her fingers tightened and then softened when she looked at him. "Adrien? Are you all right?" she asked, the question pitched between curiosity and consideration, as though she were trying not to break the surface of whatever had just rippled him. "I'm fine," he said. It sounded rehearsed. They drove on. The city hemmed them in, glass towers, neon, the jagged reflection of church steeples and corporate lobbies. The wedding felt like a photograph already fading toward sepia. He told himself the evening would congeal into the right shape. Champagne, first sleep as a husband, then the comfortable morning of shared text messages and a brunch that would let them bask in polite astonishment at what they'd arranged. But memory is a kind of weather, and a weather front had moved in. He couldn't brush the vision away. By the time the car reached his penthouse, the idea of Lena with twins threaded through him like a latent wire. He stood on the balcony for a long time, the city moving below with the indifferent hum of everything that refuses to care. His watch caught the streetlight and flashed like a lighthouse for a ship that had lost its chart. He felt absurdly like the watch was telling him when his life had shifted. He tried to catalog the practical possibilities. The simplest explanations were the ones he wanted. The babies were not his. The timeline did not match. Accentuate a word in memory and the problem would go away. But he kept returning to the same stubborn question. Had she been pregnant when they parted? The math in his head refused to align with moral comfort. Cassandra called twice that night. He answered the first time, told her he was tired and would come down for coffee. She sent him a photo of their wedding cake. Simple, geometric, white frost scalloped like the edge of constancy, with a little gold ring atop it. He stared at the image until the screen warmed his palm, and then he turned the phone face down and let it burn into the small of his hand like a pledge he couldn't afford to break. Sleep did not come in the sort of even soul time way he was used to. It came sparingly, and each time he woke he saw Lena's silhouette in the glow of the street lamp with two small heads bowed. By morning the unease had morphed into a near possession, an assignment he couldn't delegate. He went through motions at the office in a kind of haze. A meeting ran 10 minutes late because he couldn't stop rearranging the agenda in his mind. He smiled, nodded, made a decision or two he would later wish to revisit, and then he excused himself. He told his executive assistant a lie about stomach flu and walked out of the glass building into a white sky that looked like paper stretched over the city. He tried the rational paths first. He searched for Lena Hart's name, not on social media. His team made sure he avoided that trap years ago, but through old contacts, messages saved between the lines of his life. He asked a friend from the firm who knew her sister. He pressed for small indirect questions and swallowed his pride when the answers were partial and guarded. Every fact he pulled free seemed to corroborate a timeline that hurt. Their breakup had been messy and definitive, but the months following were not the clean space he had assumed. Her life, he learned in fragments, had shifted in ways he had not witnessed because he had no interest, because his interest had been elsewhere. Nobody had told him she had been pregnant, or if they had, the words had not landed. He had always been careful about whose counsel he trusted. Now, for the first time since he had learned how to buy companies and build brands, Adrien considered hiring someone to look where his discretion would not reach. He had done morally dubious things over the years under the euphemism of due diligence. He had learned to justify distance as prudence. This, he convinced himself, would be different, a search for the facts. Not to punish anyone, he lied inwardly, but to know. That evening, inside an office that smelled faintly of coffee and leather, he opened the door to a man who wore careful eyes and a coat that had not been to the wedding. Marcus Webb's business cards lived in more than one person's pocket. He was the kind of private investigator many in Adrien's circle swore they would never use, and then, when they had to, dialed with a thumb that trembled. "Congratulations," Marcus said with the propriety of someone who sold no judgment and only results. He took off his gloves and set a thin folder on the table between them like a small, dangerous book. The folder made no sound. It contained photographs, snapshots in corners of life Adrien had never wanted to see. The softness of domestic light on a child's cheek, receipts, a few clinical notes. Adrien had always measured things in assets and liabilities. Now he measured them in pixels. He opened the folder and let the images speak. There was a photo of Lena, older but unmistakable, sitting on a park bench with a twin propped on her lap. A hospital discharge form with dates. A time-stamped social media post, private but captured as a screenshot, of Lena's sister praising the little miracle with a string of hearts. A birth certificate with a hospital logo and a date that should have been irrelevant and suddenly was not. "Timeline?" he asked, and if he had thought of his voice as a ledger, he would have seen it waver. Marcus read the dates in the folder with the patience of a man who had counted out thousands of truths like this before. "Conception dates line up with the timeline you described," he said. "The twins were born about 4 months ago." The word landed like a bell in Adrien's chest. 4 months. He tried to compute the sequence of months since they had broken up, trying to find the neat slot that would absolve him. The arithmetic kept slipping away. He had been traveling then. He had been distant. He had been perhaps too eager to classify the past as unburdened. Why didn't anyone tell me? The question was small, unnecessary, and fired into the air like a signal flare. Adrien felt suddenly so much smaller than his bank accounts, as if his suit held him together and one seam had split. Marcus did not offer to explain the silence. He had his own code. "They aren't public clients," he said. "She kept it private. You asked me to find the truth, and I did." Adrien's hand closed around a photograph so tight the paper dug into his fingers. He felt the throb of something like guilt ripple through his chest, and then a more animal response. A hollow longing that had nothing to do with ownership. He was not ready for the loneliness of seeing the person he had loved with 2 small people attached to her in a way that made the world irreversibly different. The moral calculation came slamming back in. Hiring a PI felt like a betrayal of some unspoken human law. He had in the past, defended such choices as necessary. Now he saw them as the work of a man trying to remain unaffected by things that might unsettle him. He thought of Lena's privacy, of her small grieving and small victories over the years he had been away, and suddenly the folder felt obscene in his hands. "Destroy it," he said to Marcus. "All of it. Now." Marcus, who made his living by keeping records, did not flinch. He folded the photographs slowly and set them back in the folder, with the restraint of a man who understood both temptation and the legal warmth of paperwork. "You understand what you're asking?" he asked. "Once I destroy the files, they're gone." Adrien had never been more sure of anything. He wanted fewer paper trails of his curiosity, not more. Curiosity had been the first step toward possession in his life. He had learned the hard way that the paths curiosity opened often led to choices that could not be reversed. "Yes," he said. "Destroy it, and tell me what you know, verbal. No copies, no backups. I don't want anything circulating." Marcus nodded. He stood, and for the first time since he had been in that room, Adrien noticed the faint tremor in the man's hand as he turned the folder edge up and fed photographs into a shredder Marcus claimed he kept for clients who regretted their questions. The shredder fought the paper, and the sound it made, homely, ordinary, irrevocable, felt like confession. When it was over, Adrien left Marcus's office with a hollow in his throat and the curious sense that he had not erased anything at all. The knowledge itself, once remembered, could not be unremembered. He had tried to buy distance and found himself returned to an older, more vulnerable place where decisions were not unit tests. He did not sleep that night either, but he did do what he had promised himself he would never do again. He went to Lena's neighborhood. It was a modest strip a few neighborhoods from the towers where he owned trophy buildings, a place where the light sounded softer and the facades were older. Rain had begun as a bruise on the sky and turned into a ribbon that made the city smell like wet street and lemon peel. He parked 2 blocks away and walked until the city gave the features he remembered a new language. Laundry hung between buildings like prayer flags, a corner deli with a neon sign that hummed like a lullaby of its own. He told himself he would not knock. He told himself he would watch from the opposite curb with the distance a man of his means was accustomed to maintaining. But there are some things curiosity will not allow you to hold at arm's length. He stood, soaked through to the suit jacket that had been tailored to keep him brief and efficient, outside the building where Lena lived. He imagined her in the doorway with the twins. He imagined the small world she had built without him inside it. He knocked on the door because the act of knocking felt like the only honest option left to him. The hallway smelled of baby powder and steam. Someone had left a small pair of shoes by the threshold that looked to have been used and tended with hands that could not be hurried. He knocked again with a fist that had once been used to sign deals and then had to be pressed against his chest to hold down the surge of fear. When Lena opened the door, she looked as if she had been expecting a different knock and was still surprised to get his. She stood there with the faint arc of tiredness under her eyes, hair tucked haphazardly into a bun, linen shirt soft from many washes. A twin whimpered in her arms. The other one slept with a small hand curled around a blanket. For a second, Adrien just looked. The 5 years between them folded like paper. He could feel his wedding band like an accusation. He could feel the city, the life he had arranged into rooms and schedules, pressing at the back of him with a weight that made him want to back away. He could not. "You shouldn't be here," Lena said. Her voice was steady, small as a stone in a river. She held the door wide enough for him to see the hallway behind her. The twins' bassinet stood against the wall in the entryway, like a tiny altar to ordinary survival. "I know," he said. He could see how tiredness mapped across her face. Small dark circles, the way she carried herself with an economy of motion that made every gesture seem measured to the work of protecting 2 lives. He had known Lena when the map of her life was being drawn in someone else's ink. Now the lines had been lifted into something she had made herself. There were strangers to be negotiated when children were involved, and there were rules Lena had learned to inscribe herself. She had not invited complication into their daily life without the armor of boundaries. 5 minutes, she said, and there was nothing in the tone that invited argument. 5 minutes, not for reconciliation, not for a confession, but for the basic curiosity of allowing someone who might be their father to see them without endangering the fragile order she had built. Adrien nearly laughed at the austerity of the rule. 5 minutes felt like a tribunal. But it was also a miracle, permission in a world that had only ever offered him walls. He took a breath that tasted like rain and nodded. Lena stepped back to let him in. The apartment was small in the way that homes become honest when they are built for people rather than presentation. A chipped mug sat by the sink. There was a poster on the wall with a picture of a boat and a child's drawing taped over one edge. A laundry basket leaned against a chair like a faithful sighing companion. The bassinet squeaked slightly when the sleeping twin shifted. Adrien kept his hands where he had learned to keep them, unclenched, open, mindful. He had never thought of himself as handsome in the domestic way. He had thought in terms of brand portraits, tailored suits, the right angle for publicity. Here that training did him no good. Lena set one of the twins in his arms, the boy, and the world narrowed down to the small, hot weight against his chest. The touch was electric and instantaneous. The baby fitted into his crook like a promise he had never negotiated for. The baby's fingers, as if by instinct, latched to his thumb with terrible, tiny force. Adrien's breath stopped for a sliver of time, as if someone had clipped the line that kept him tethered to the life he'd known. He smelled milk and the faint tang of detergent and something else. Lena's perfume from long ago, the ghost of a memory that had gathered moisture in the intervening years. "You don't get to decide time," Lena said, watching him like someone making a careful record. "You get 5 minutes." He looked down at the child and felt the syntax of his past choices rearrange. The city that had once applauded his every acquisition suddenly seemed to have been built on a foundation of small, uninteresting exchanges he had missed. A missed diaper change, a bedtime story he'd never read, a hospital hallway he had never entered unless a camera was rolling. "Why didn't you tell me?" He didn't know if he asked the question for his own need or to inhale information that could make his life less dangerous. Lena's expression held no indulgence for recrimination and no appetite for pity. "Because I had to make sure they were safe first," she said. "Because I didn't want them to become your problem. I wanted them to be mine to protect before anyone else stepped in." There was no performance to her words. They were the ledger of a woman who had elected to carry weight alone, rather than risk the small people under her watch. Adrien tried to offer an apology, and found it felt like currency, insufficient for the amount owed. He wanted to say he had been a different man. Instead he said clumsily, "I didn't know. He stopped, because the rest of the sentence would turn into excuse. The baby in his arms yawned and then made a small sound like a question. Lena hummed the lullaby he'd remembered quietly, without looking at him, her voice threading through the room and hitting him like something soft and unavoidable. He recognized the tune and felt that old pull, the one that had nothing to do with business decisions and everything to do with belonging. Adrien's watch ticked in a way that made the seconds seem too precise for the moment. He had sold the idea of time to himself as something that could be purchased. Time off, time on, better time. Here, in Lena's apartment with a baby whose fingers kept closing around his thumb as if he were made for gripping. The kind of time that mattered was the kind you held with your full attention. "You can stay," Lena said finally, and he almost missed the permission because it sounded like a negotiation more than a gift. But 5 minutes. He wanted more than 5 minutes. He wanted the years crouched behind him to arrange themselves differently, wanted to find loopholes in fate. He met her eyes, the tired, steady green, and for the first time since the church bells had stopped ringing over an altar that felt increasingly like a display, Adrien felt a gravity he had not accounted for in his spreadsheets. He should have left immediately, honored her rule and done the decent thing that distance commands. Instead, he sat on the edge of a couch that had seen many small crises and allowed the baby to sleep against his chest like inheritance. The child's breath was a tiny, urgent thing that reordered the priorities he had thought inviolable. Outside, the rain increased and the city made a sound like cloth rubbing against stone. The evening had become an instrument that played them small and inconsequential in the way life often does. A lullaby in a minor, a note held long enough for something to change. If this moment reached you in a city with its own quiet stories, tell us where you're watching from. It's a small thing, maybe, but it's the sort of question that roots a story somewhere besides a man's regrets. Lena moved about like someone practiced at economy, settling a blanket, checking the thermostat, finding a bottle. She filled it with water that she heated and tested with a quick, precise movement, the way someone who has done this at 3 in the morning knows without thinking. Adrien tried to learn, observe, mirror, be useful. At first he fumbled as if his hands belonged in a different era. The bottle slipped from his fingers once and he nearly apologized in corporate language. Lena corrected him with a soft instruction and a small private smile that could be read as either forgiveness or a reminder that he had to earn his place. Their conversation sketched itself in the margins. They did not argue. They did not reconstruct the past. They traded information in the currency of necessity. Lena explained, without melodrama, the logistics of her choosing to keep their children's existence private, not as a judgment against him but as a protective strategy. There were reasons: a messy breakup, community rumors, a need to build stability without interference. She had not wanted the twins to be fodder for his business world. She had hoped to give them solidarity before they entered any life that might be complicated by notoriety or wealth. Adrien listened and felt his old defenses loosen. Some of his pride, sharp, bright, occasionally useful, had dulled in the face of the small, consistent labor of motherhood. Listening to her talk about diaper changes and appointments, and the way a baby's cheek fits exactly into the angle of one's elbow, he felt disarmed in a way negotiation never had managed. The 5 minutes lengthened into a quarter hour. He knew this was transgression, but he also felt the raw, honest desire to be present. He had not known that the thing he lacked was not money or status, but the willingness to schedule himself to stay. He had built structures to insulate himself from unpredictable need. The 2 hours in Lena's apartment felt like an experiment in humility he had not signed up for but could no longer avoid. When he left that night, he walked back into the rain feeling as if he carried something with him that could not be measured on any balance sheet. The soft weight of a small fist still around his thumb. A lullaby remembered in his head in the key of Lena's voice. He drove back to his penthouse and up to the window, the city an array of lights stitched into darkness. Cassandra waited, perhaps worried, perhaps relieved. She had sent 2 messages, none of them accusatory, all of them patient. He could not tell her why his wedding night had been interrupted by the image of a woman carrying 2 babies across a crosswalk. He could not tell her that a shredder had hummed in an office, and he had asked that paper be turned to ash. He could not tell her that a tiny boy had latched to his thumb and pressed some unnameable claim against his heart. He stood by the window and watched the rain find the glass, turning the city into watercolors. In a room designed to hold no surprises, something thudded against him that felt like a different kind of wealth. Messy, unexpected, irrevocable. He had said "I do" that afternoon, and meant it in the way grown men mean things they have prepared for. Now, because of 3 blocks and a crosswalk and the humming of a lullaby, he found himself reaching for an answer he had no practice giving. He had been married for less than a day. He had just met his possible children. He had already begun to step into shoes that did not carry him comfortably. He turned off the lights and pretended to sleep, but it was a curious pretense. The city slumbered and he lay awake cataloging small details. The way Lena had corrected him on how to hold a bottle. The way one of the twins had opened his eyes and fixed Adrien with the steady gaze of someone who already understood truth. The smell of detergent that had a softness he could not purchase. He imagined waking up in the morning and choosing differently. And for the first time in many accounted years, he thought not of acquisitions and mergers but of a name. Oliver James. He had heard Lena say it once, a small, offhanded thing, as if the name were an anchor she threw into a harbor to keep something from drifting away. The syllables tasted like a contract he had not yet signed, and yet the hunger to know the child more deeply grew with every tiny breath. By dawn the rain had passed and the city exhaled. He sat at his kitchen island and drank coffee that had gone cold because a part of him waited for consequences to arrive with the sun. They always did. He drilled into himself the old habits of order, the capacity to frame his life as a set of choices with neat outcomes. But choices had a way of landing in other people's hands, and he had felt the weight of one such fall. He was not a naive man. He knew the law of unintended consequences better than most. He knew what it would cost to rearrange a life built on predictability, trust to rebuild, schedules altered, the soft humiliation of asking for help from people who had only ever admired his self-sufficiency. He knew there would be anger and there could be permission withheld. He also knew, with a clarity that shocked him, that when the tiny hand had gripped his thumb that first time, something in him had changed its axis. He had decisions to make. He had to tell Cassandra the truth, eventually. He had to reckon with the ethics of what he had done. Hiring Marcus had been a crime against his new vows and against decency, even if he had tried to erase every record of it. He had to decide whether he would be the sort of father who showed up, or the sort who paid for presence in a quieter currency, but remained absent for the hard, ordinary work of it. At 9 o'clock, the phone on his kitchen counter lit up. It was David Chen, his business partner, and the tone in David's voice brooked no small talk. There was an investor crisis, something that could unravel in a week unless Adrien handled it. Habit gathered like a tide, urging him to put the company first. He listened as spreadsheets and projections and reputations were enumerated, each one a lever pulled on his attention. Adrien placed the phone down and looked at the blankness of his hands. They had just held a child as if he had always done it. They had also signed dozens of agreements that made men like him indispensable. The two lives, one of spreadsheets and investors, one of lullabies and diaper changes, sat in his chest and argued like children over a toy. He made a decision that night that would not be final, but would mark the beginning of a path. He would not turn away. He would not do the easy thing and allow the infant's life to remain someone else's responsibility. But he would not do the performative thing either, showing up for tea and photographs and then retreating when the real needs came. He would learn. He would be clumsy and persistent, and he would be accountable. He did not know how to start. He only knew the small steps. He called Marcus again, not to resurrect the folder but to confirm that the files had been destroyed. He asked Marcus to sign a paper that guaranteed non-disclosure. He told David he would take the lead on the investor meeting, but that his availability might require delegation. He bought a plane ticket on impulse and then canceled it when he thought better. In the days that followed, he returned to Lena's building with a different intention, and with hands that remembered the small weight they had carried. Lena's rules did not bend at his asking. She had made them with the steadfastness of someone who would not permit her children to be experimented on. She accepted practical offers for help without surrendering her independence. They negotiated like adults. Visits scheduled in advance, an agreement that he would not make unilateral decisions, respect for her need to provide stability before opening the door to his presence. And he began, clumsily, to be a man who showed up. He learned the sorts of things a manual cannot teach. How to soothe a wail that fills a room like anger, how to leave a bottle at exactly the right temperature without testing it until the child protests, how to be present when a simple cough at 2 in the morning feels like an omen. He made mistakes, and Lena tolerated a few because she could see he tried. She watched him not with the hope of dissuading but with an assessment that took time. Does he keep coming? Do his choices match his words? One night, after he changed a diaper successfully enough to feel a small surge of pride, he went home to his penthouse and sat in the dark with a different kind of ambition, to restructure the part of his life that had been built to minimize need. The feeling was not heroic. It was practical and messy and required more than grand speeches. It required him to prioritize and to risk investor patience. He found that to do this, he would need to be honest with his board, to accept that fatherhood would be visible not only to his family, but to the markets that measured time in quarters. A week later, at a small wood-paneled conference room that smelled faintly of lemon oil, Adrien stood before David and the board and did something he seldom did with such rawness. He spoke about time as a responsibility rather than a commodity. He did not use sentiment. He used truth. "I'm a husband now and I've met my children," he said plainly. "My responsibilities have changed. I will not hide that fact, and I believe that the work we do must adapt without sacrificing excellence." There were questions. There were probing concerns about investor confidence. But something shifted in the room as their leader declared his whole life, instead of the compartmentalized variants he had offered before. A senior investor asked for a meeting with the family, not out of malice but as a test of credibility. An old-school figure whose handshake still carried weight. Adrien agreed. He saw then that his private choices would not remain private for long. Transparency, for better or worse, was now part of his bargain. He returned to Lena with the bit of concrete he had been given. An investor wanted to understand how his life change would not imperil the business. Lena met the news with the practical skepticism of someone who had been asked many times to perform miracles with what little she had. "No investors in the house," she said first. "No photo ops. If your people are going to meet them, we do it on our terms." Adrien accepted her terms because he had learned what compromise meant in the language of small vital things. He told her that nothing would be staged, nothing exploitative. She nodded, an agreement, not a surrender. There would be many more tests. Adrien did not assume gratitude. He had to earn trust with a steady measure of presence and the slow accumulation of reliability. For now, however, he had breached the wall between his life and the small, luminous one Lena protected. The consequences would follow like mail, accounted for, unavoidable. And yet that night before the tests, before obligations caught up to him in the daylight, he lay awake with the weight of a small body bivouacked against his chest when she allowed it. 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, an extra hour on a Saturday. And the world felt like something he had not built but might learn to steward. The city outside hummed through panes of glass, and money hummed elsewhere. Inside his ribcage, a lullaby hummed back. He had just gotten married, and the life he had been married into had just acquired an impossible complication. 2 small people who would track him down by the grip of a thumb and the familiarity of a lullaby. The next steps were not written in contracts but in small daily obligations. He could not purchase the hours that mattered. He could only show up and be measured by the work he did in going. As the morning light widened and the city woke, Adrien made himself one last promise of the sort that could either be a beginning or a polite preface. He would not be the man who arrived only for the grand rooms of life. He would prove it in the small hours. He would begin imperfectly to live differently. Outside Lena's window, a delivery bike threaded the narrow street. A toddler somewhere behind a window screamed with joy, and a neighbor banged a pot, a sloppy, improvised percussion that said, somewhere, life kept happening, urgent, ordinary, and decidedly his to either join or ignore. He chose, in that small, private instant, to try. He did not know how it would end. That question, stretched out and humming between them, would take more than a weekend to answer. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was neither tidy nor theatrical. Adrien learned the modest grammar of motherhood the way he had once learned the syntax of a merger, by repetition, by fumbling, by paying attention to the small margins where meaning accumulates. He kept his promise to Lena in ways that took more courage than any boardroom speech, showing up consistently, stepping back when asked, and letting errands and car keys be evidence of a life being rearranged rather than a series of proclamations. Cassandra listened to his confession on a bench outside a museum cafe, the place chosen because she had loved its quiet, the way sunlight filtered through the atrium. She had the same composure she had worn at the wedding, but it was thinner now, like something fine that could not be patched without showing the repair. He told her everything he owed her. The crosswalk, the PI folder that had hissed through a shredder, the 5-minute rule, the child who had closed his tiny fist around Adrien's thumb. He told her not to expect immediate answers, that the only promise he could give was that he would not pretend the moment didn't exist. Cassandra did not make a spectacle of leaving. She was not a spiteful woman. She had many places inside herself that required honesty. "You married me as who you were," she said, voice level, the way someone might note a fact described in a letter of intent. "I married the man who valued order and predictability." She paused and folded the napkin in her lap. "This is not the same arrangement. I can't be second to what you're not yet willing to reckon with." They spoke kindly and precisely about what that meant. Cassandra asked for time, Space not to punish him but to decide if she could live amid a life that had pivoted like this overnight. She left with her suitcase that weekend, not as a grand gesture but as the practical step of someone reclaiming a piece of their itinerary. She wanted to be free to choose a life without the shadow of a secret, even where that secret had not been deliberately kept from her. Adrien watched her go and felt the small, private grief of a man who knew he had made a promise, and was now learning the cost of keeping it honestly. That grief, more than guilt, became a tool. If remorse had been the first heat strike, practicality was the work that followed. He delegated more ruthlessly at the firm, appointing a new chief operating officer to oversee daily operations, while he took a slowed, steadier role. It was an ugly, important conversation for a room used to men playing at availability. He did not perform absence as strategy any longer. He explained to the board with a clarity that startled some and steadied others. He would be present for his family. He would also ensure the company ran well without him tethered to every hour. There was resistance, of course. Change at scale brings critics out like storm clouds. A conservative investor sniffed at perceived distraction and suggested that leadership required undivided attention. Adrien did not dismiss the concern. He reframed it. In an address that could have been a PR stunt but was not, he described leadership as stewardship, an ethic that required him to build resilience in the company, to mentor successors, to plan so that personal changes would not destabilize others. He did not demand applause, he asked for trust and showed his plan. The test came sooner than anyone had expected. A high-stakes negotiation with a Portland investor, one that involved a major new line of business, coincided with a late-night pediatric emergency. Oliver's small cough became a fever that rose stubbornly. Lena called Adrien awake just after midnight with the kind of voice that asked for more than sympathy. He sat up and, without hesitation now, canceled the travel he had planned for the Portland meeting. He found that the board, despite grumbles, could function. David Chen stepped up to run negotiations. Adrien stayed in the emergency room, pacing the fluorescent halls and learning a different kind of patience. The investor learned of Adrien's decision and, true to the earlier warning, requested a meeting with the family to assess his confidence in Adrien's leadership. It was the sort of request that could have felt humiliating, an intrusion into a life Lena had fought to shelter. Instead, it became an opportunity to put the new terms of trust into public practice. Lena agreed to a meeting on her conditions: neutral location, no photographs, no press, no demands for staged performances. Adrien accepted those terms gratefully. The meeting was arranged in a small community center room with a round table and a kettle in the corner, a place where the aesthetic of wealth did not apply, and where small chairs lined the walls like mute witnesses. The investor arrived with his usual air of careful judgment, but he could not disguise that he had expected performance and instead found tenderness. The twins were there, alert and unafraid, Emma reaching for the edge of the table with a sticky, enthusiastic curiosity, Oliver tucking his face into a plush elephant. Adrien spoke plainly about his priorities: the delegation he had put in place, the contingency leadership structure, the transparency he had chosen to practice. Lena spoke with the authority of a woman unaccustomed to making apologies for protecting her children. She explained the conditions under which she had allowed Adrien into their lives and her boundaries moving forward. The investor, who had come to test confidence, found himself listening instead. When Oliver reached across the table and tapped the investor's sleeve with a grubby finger, and when Emma sat up in Lena's lap to watch Adrien place his hand gently on her head, something in the room shifted. The investor's voice, which had been cool and clipped, softened. He offered a handshake of a different kind, an admission that the man before him had refused to compartmentalize his life, and instead had acted to sustain both home and work. "You passed a different test than the one I proposed," the investor said later, once the children were soothed and the kettle had boiled down to a soft rattle. "You showed me structure that can hold this change." He did not offer sentimental congratulations. He made pragmatic pledges, continued funding under specific governance changes and a joint plan to meet quarterly so that leadership continuity would be demonstrable. The approval felt less like external validation and more like a permission slip to continue trying. The real currency of trust was still measured in small acts: showing up for a pediatrician appointment, answering a call from Lena instead of ghosting it, accepting that weekends would no longer belong to a calendar of charity galas. Adrien learned to take on the mundane with a seriousness he had once reserved for acquisitions. He found elation in rituals, bath time, spooning applesauce into small mouths, reading a picture book in a voice he'd never needed to use before. His timing faltered sometimes. He missed a parent-teacher intake and had to apologize earnestly. He burned dinner on a Tuesday, laughed with Lena as they scavenged cereal for the twins, and began to understand that presence was more persuasive than proclamations. Housing became the next tangible negotiation. Lena was wary of the gleam of big houses and the sudden influx of staff. She had built a nest that functioned. She did not want it destabilized by chandeliers or a staff of strangers. Adrien proposed options pragmatically. He would sell the penthouse he had never felt truly at home in, and they would look for a house near Lena's neighborhood with a modest garden, practical layout, and a room for a home office rather than a showpiece master suite. He insisted on a fair division of control. He would make space in his life, not subsume theirs into his empire. For Lena, the idea was tempting and terrifying. It meant relinquishing the solitary control she had cultivated and inviting uncertainty. She also saw how much Adrien had changed in small, meaningful ways, how he prioritized pediatric appointments over shareholders' dinners, how he had insisted on speaking candidly to the board about his schedule. She agreed to a trial, a rental near her block for 6 months, no joint purchases, and a written practical co-parenting agreement. They drafted the agreement with Claire and a mediator present. Schedules, emergency protocols, financial support, decision-making processes for health and education, and firm terms about publicity. The document read like an adult map of mutual responsibility. Lena signed not out of trust alone, but because she had measured gestures and found them consistent. In the weeks that followed, Adrien learned to be reliably boring in the best way possible. He carved out rituals that became the scaffolding of their new life. Saturday mornings at a small bakery where the twins discovered croissants, weekday evenings with a shared dinner rota, a bedtime story that he read in a voice that grew softer with each telling. He appointed a sleep coach for Emma and Oliver, and after 2 failed attempts at a nap training episode that resulted in a lot of mutual crying and laughter, they found a rhythm. He reorganized travel so that seeing the children did not become an event, but part of his week. Claire, Lena's sister, came to see him not only with skepticism, but gradually with a small allowance of hope. She watched him change from the seriousness of distance to a man who could accept spit up with a resigned smile. Not every test was gentle. A board member leaked a rumor about the company's values wobbling. A tabloid tried to insinuate a scandal around the timing of the twins' birth. Adrien had to navigate the ugly edges of a public life he had thought he managed by keeping pieces separate. He met those tests in the way he had tried to meet the personal ones, by not pretending they could be finessed away. He addressed the leak with transparency, refusing to weaponize Lena's privacy for reputational gain. He offered the tabloid a statement that emphasized respect for his family's boundaries and paid a price by turning down opportunistic photo deals. Some in his circle scoffed, others watched, and a few were persuaded by the steadiness of his decisions. Practical arrangements multiplied. Lena took a job offer at a community clinic associated with the local children's hospital, work she had done in fits and starts while Oliver and Emma were infants. The position offered predictable hours and a team she trusted. She worried about losing autonomy, about the vulnerability of entering a partnership where a man with resources could overpower her choices. Adrien counteroffered with a different kind of assistance. He shored up childcare options, paid for a part-time nanny who respected Lena's rules, and insisted that he would maintain his presence for the key hours the twins needed him. He did not demand to be recognized as the financial savior. He asked only to be considered a partner in practical terms and to be held accountable for it. The relationship developed punctuation marks of intimacy, small human moments rather than grand declarations. One evening, after a long day of work and a toddler meltdown over spilled yogurt, Lena found Adrien on the floor, assembling a broken toy with patience he had once reserved for contracts. The kids were in different corners building towers with wooden blocks. He looked up as she entered the room and offered her a tired, genuine smile. "Can I do the nap tonight?" he asked. She agreed, and he covered them with light blanket edges, listened to their breathing, and felt an ache that was not regret, but an earnestness he had not known he could carry. There were also missteps that required repair. Adrien balked at therapy initially, thinking logistics would suffice. Lena insisted, and they began sessions with a counselor who specialized in co-parenting dynamics. In the early meetings, he had to confront habits ingrained in him. The urge to solve with money, the reflex to withdraw from messy emotional labor, the assumption that presence could be purchased. He failed sometimes. He was late to a school orientation once, and Lena's patience snapped briefly, revealing the rawness she had kept beneath composed surfaces. They argued quietly and with edges about who did what and how credit was given for the unseen labor of parenting. Each argument ended with something less like resolution and more like a new clause in the ongoing contract of their life. They learned that apologies were not an eraser, but the mortar that held two different bricks together. Marcus, the private investigator, appeared only once more, an unexpected call one afternoon to confirm the shredding of the folder. Adrien met him in the small room where their earlier exchange had occurred and watched as Marcus slid a single clean envelope across the table, a signed affidavit confirming the destruction of files. "Some of my clients keep records for safety," Marcus said, "but you wanted this gone." Adrien accepted the envelope and felt, absurdly, like a man who had finally paid a debt for an emotional trespass. He asked Marcus not to run any more checks. Marcus nodded. Some lines he understood should never be crossed again. Months became a stitched sequence of banal, beautiful proof. Adrien sold the penthouse and bought a house that was neither a trophy nor a compromise. A brick townhouse with a small yard, an easy walk to Lena's block, a kitchen that fit for two people who liked to cook in disordered bursts. He insisted there be space for children's shoes by the door, and for his desk to be small enough to encourage him to step away from it. He had an office near the back, with a window that opened to seedlings pushing up in a modest bed. He kept his timepiece, but it felt differently now, less as a countdown and more as a metronome marking family routines. Trust once given had to be renewed in practice. Adrien failed at being perfect. Emma had a fever on a weekend when an investor dinner had been planned, and he canceled it without a backwards glance. His colleagues complained about the hit to a relationship, but his team, who had watched his reorientation, respected his choice because it came with follow-through. He trained another leader to handle the dinners. He learned to justify his priorities with competence rather than excuses. The clearest test of his commitment came in a smaller, more intimate form, a 2 a.m. hospital trip when Oliver choked on a piece of apple. Adrien drove like a man who had learned to let speed be dictated by instinct rather than schedule. Lena was already there when he arrived, panic folded into a thin, focused calm. They moved in a practiced synchrony, the lean efficiency of people who had to act fast for a child's well-being. In the waiting room, Adrien found he could articulate fear without flinching. He sat beside Lena, and when Oliver recovered and dozed under the care of nurses, he placed his fingers over hers and did not say anything that needed to be gilded by words. The emergency had asked of him a presence that money could not buy, and he had given it. The 2-year montage that followed, less a montage and more a slow-lived accumulation, was not cinematic theater but the small domestic things that show proof in time's own slow voice. Oliver and Emma learned to walk, then to run, and their hands found Adrien's in ways that were urgent and natural. Saturday mornings were noisy with cereal and cartoons and a dog they had adopted at Lena's insistence. Adrien learned to braid Emma's fine hair in the mornings and to pretend he knew the rules of a playground. He took Oliver to a pre-toddler soccer class and found himself cheering for a small, uncoordinated kick with a fervor he would never have shown for a quarterly board result. They hosted a modest birthday party on a back porch with hand-painted banners, not the kind he would have once outsourced to an event planner. He watched people he had once kept at arm's length: Claire, his sister-in-law-ish figure, David, who had grown into a friend and ally, even Cassandra, who occasionally stopped by to return a plant and found herself gradually accommodating a new acquaintance in her own life. There were moments of awkwardness, old friends asking questions they should not ask, neighbors offering help in clumsy ways, but the family navigated them with the steady, imperfect grace of people who had chosen to be present. On an ordinary Thursday 2 years after that rain-soaked night, Adrien stood at the kitchen window of the house he now kept and watched the light pour over the small yard, which was striped by patches where Oliver had tried to plant a sapling and failed several times. Emma sat on his hip, stubbornly refusing to let go of a spoon, and Oliver trailed at the back, shoes untied because a 2-year-old's priorities are small and immediate. The house smelled like toast and spilled orange juice, an aroma he now associated with the best parts of his life. David sent a message on his phone about a new acquisition opportunity, but Adrien did not read it right away. He watched Oliver chase a ladybug across the grass, then reach up and grab Adrien's hand as if it were an anchor. He closed his fingers around the small, warm fist and felt, as he once had on that first night, the gravity that had called him away from the artifice of a life measured in ledgers. Only now the stakes had been tested and found sufficient. He had proven he could be trusted not because he had announced it, but because he had been steady through small unpredictables. Lena moved through the kitchen and met his eyes with a look that had less surprise than contentment. They had settled into a new kind of intimacy, less drama, more partnership, wherein both of them maintained their edges and met at a middle that was negotiated daily. There was still friction. There were still conversations that felt like minor treaty-making, but there was also laughter, and the kind of companionship that grew from having endured enough tests to see the other person's consistent pattern. They took the twins across the same crosswalk where years before, Adrien had stopped mid-journey to see a woman he loved carrying 2 babies into the world. This time there was no suspended disbelief. There was instead a family moving together under the honest light of day. Emma toddled ahead and turned, chubby hand extended. She let go to run toward a puddle, and Oliver, balancing on his unsteady legs, followed her lead. Adrien and Lena walked side by side, their hands swinging free for a breath as they watched the small people learn the cadence of life. Someone nearby played a lullaby on a busker's guitar, the same lullaby Lena had hummed that first night. Adrien felt a small, familiar tug. The motif of the song had become a kind of thread running through their shared history. And he looked at Lena. Their eyes met and then turned to the twins who were arguing with the seriousness of children about whether a puddle could be crossed with shoes on. "I used to think time was just something to buy," Adrien said softly, the city sound folding around them. "I got married and thought I'd keep everything tidy. Then I saw you and them across the street." Lena smiled, small and private. "You did," she said, "and you're still buying, but now it's different things." She glanced at Oliver, who was refusing to yield the puddle. "You buy time with faces, not with things." The afternoon narrowed into a small domestic perfection. A scraped knee soothed in the back of his car. A lullaby hummed as he drove. A pizza with too many toppings made by hands that had learned to share the work. In the kitchen that night, as the twins fell asleep and the house dimmed, Adrien sat at the table and set his watch face down. He still glanced at it sometimes, as if its tick could be read as counsel, but he no longer let it define every choice. Time, he had discovered, was not an asset to be hoarded but a set of commitments to be kept. He had thought once that the worst thing he could lose was a deal. He learned then that the only losses that truly mattered were missed afternoons and absent hands. Redemption in his life did not arrive as a single transformative moment, but as a long series of small, faithful actions. He had hired no miracle to replace a father. He became one by doing the work that fathers do, being up for the appointments, taking the midnight calls, learning how to braid hair and to braid patience with it. Lena had not needed him to be perfect. She had needed him to be present and accountable. In time, they formalized their family life not as an announcement but as a practice. Joint decisions about school, agreements about media exposure, a shared calendar that was less about efficiency and more about honoring what mattered. They established rituals: Sunday pancakes, an annual camping trip that usually included a forgotten tent pole and giant marshmallows, and they learned to forgive each other for being imperfect. Adrien grew comfortable with a gentler measure of prestige, one that showed up in the way his children greeted him, rather than the way his company reported earnings. The city continued to glitter beyond the windows with its towers and meetings, Adrien did not escape it, nor did he want to. He had reshaped his relationships within it. David remained his partner, Claire remained a steady presence, Marcus remained a closed chapter whose only function was to remind Adrien of limits. Cassandra forged a new life that occasionally crossed paths with theirs without friction, less a wound than a boundary that had been respected. On an ordinary evening, 2 years after a rainstorm and a wedding and a crosswalk that had rearranged several lives, Adrien stood in the doorway of the backyard and watched Oliver and Emma chase each other around a small tree they had planted together. Lena came up behind him, draped a sweater around his shoulders and rested her head on his arm. The light was warm. His watch caught it and shone like a small, private sun. "You kept your promise," Lena said. Not a challenge but an observation. Adrien looked down at the children and then at her. "I've been keeping it," he said. "I am trying every day." She smiled. "That's enough," she said, because sometimes that was all a person needed to see. Evidence over rhetoric. He thought of the path that had delivered him here. Vows spoken in a church that now felt less like a showpiece than the beginning of a complicated life. A shredder that had devoured the easy certainties of curiosity. A small apartment where a woman had guarded 2 lives. A meeting in a community center that demanded vulnerability. Nights awake in the hospital and afternoons of spilled cereal. Each moment had shaped him in ways that no statute or contract could capture. He had been given something far more instructive than forgiveness. He had been given a chance to prove, through action, that he had chosen differently. The twins raced toward the back door, squealing, and he bent to scoop them up, feeling the familiar pressure of small hands on his shirt. Lena laughed, the sound a clear instrument in the dusk. The house behind them hummed with quiet domestic light, and beyond it the city blinked its neon eyes. He had lived on both sides of that window now, and what mattered was the view he chose to keep. If this story reaches you in a city of your own, consider where you spend your time. Tell us in the comments which street you're watching from and how your life marks the small choices that shape it. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe for more stories about the messy, beautiful work of building a life worth keeping.